Literacy, something incredibly important in all schools. I mean, you won't find a school that doesn't say reading is fundamental and critical to a student's ability to succeed. And yet we miss the effective ways to teach kids to read and the change management piece of how we change to appropriately address it. Hey, everyone. Dr. Jones here with another episode of Seeing to Lead. And this week, we talked to Dr. Karen Dudek-Brannan. She is an expert in literacy, and during this conversation gives us so many strategies to help improve the structures that we currently have. Now, Karen knows that it's not just about effective ways to teach kids to read, but it's also about how we put those changes in place. But what's most important in what Karen tells us and shares with us today is how we need to collaborate for better literacy success among our students. In fact, something that stood out to me was that when we talk about the joy of reading, or we're worried about change, that it's hard to have joy or excitement for something if you haven't been taught how to do it. That's just the start of some of the great things Karen has to say. But it's important that you listen all the way through this episode, because at the end, she gives two fabulous resources on literacy and executive functioning. I'm telling you, it's value all day long. So what I would like you to do is, as always, subscribe to the show, but leave an honest rating and review, because I'm sure this episode is going to energize you to do that. Not to mention, it helps out a lot as I try to offer value through this show to more and more people. Finally, this episode is part of the National Literacy Month with RIF campaign, a partnership between the B Podcast Network and Reading is Fundamental to host numerous productive conversations across our network of podcasts about developing kids' reading and literacy skills for life. Now that that's said, let's hear from Dr. Karen Dudek-Brannan on Seeing to Lead.
Teachers need to feel like you're taking something off of their plate, not putting something on. And when you're talking about accommodations in the general education classroom, it feels like they're doing something extra.
Dr. Chris Jones here, and welcome to Seeing to Lead, a show designed to help leaders increase their ability to effectively support, engage, and empower their staff through intentional practices so that they create an environment where everyone reaches their greatest level of success. On Seeing to Lead, communication rules the day as we hear voices from both teachers and leaders in an effort to examine perspectives, highlight misunderstandings, and provide steps to ultimately bridge the gap between what teachers need and provide through thoughtful dialogue. This show is about amplifying voices, creating understanding, and providing information to help everyone continually improve. I want to personally thank you for taking the time. Now, let's get to getting better.
Dr. Karen Dudek-Brannan is the founder and owner-operator of Dr. Karen LLC, a company focused on empowering therapists and educators to design interventions that support language, literacy, and executive functioning. She has a doctorate in special education, director of special education and assistive technology credentials from Illinois State University, as well as a master's and bachelor's from Illinois State University in speech-language pathology. She spent 14 years in the school systems and has held various roles in leadership in higher education, teaching and mentoring clinicians. She's the host of the Facto Leaders podcast, where she shares evidence-based practices, her own experiences, and guest interviews on topics relating to education and healthcare reform. She currently holds a management role with the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services. Now, Karen has been a guest. I think this is Karen's second time on the show.
Yep.
I've been on her show. I've been on a show on De Facto Leaders with another leader, Chris Dodge. So we've talked a lot, and I can say that Karen is fantastic. I'm excited to talk to her because she really is focused in on supporting language literacy and executive functioning. So Karen, again, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk.
Yeah, this will be good. We never have problems talking to each other, that's for sure. We usually get on a roll.
For sure.
But why don't I just kick it off with, because people have heard your other episodes. But why don't I just kick it off with what area of education, schooling, even life are you passionate about?
Obviously, one of the things that we wanted to talk about today was literacy. So I will start with that because when I started off as an SLP in the school systems, I would say that was one of my biggest pain points. School is about a lot of things. Literacy is a huge piece of that can impact whole other areas. But for speech pathologists specifically, we have a background in language and cognition, which has a huge impact on your ability to learn to read and write and spell, among other things, which is, again, literacy is not just reading, it's all of those things as well. And we know that part of school is learning how to read, but there are a lot of people who can play a part in that process. And for speech pathologists specifically, when we're talking about language therapy, which ends up being a huge portion of speech pathologist caseload in the school, if you have a student who is working on language, more often than not, reading is going to be impacted. And it can be really difficult when you have an area like language that's so big to figure out, I have 30 to 40 minutes a week with my students. How do I work on all of these things? And specifically to the schools, where do I fit in when it comes to supporting literacy? Because I'm not a reading teacher. I'm not a language arts teacher that has a 40-minute language arts period every day. What is my piece of this puzzle? So I'd say what I'm passionate about is helping people who are in that subject matter expert. And obviously I started with SLPs, but I think about other areas as well on that special ed and related service provider team. But how do I help them to figure out the specific tactical things they need to do when they have students in front of them, but also think about the bigger picture? Because if you're going to make good decisions about what do I do, what's my piece of the puzzle here that I can work on with my students when they're right in front of me, when I have a small group or a one-on-one therapy session, or when I'm going into a classroom, I have to think about what everybody else is doing. So I have to think about this bigger plan and figure out how what I do is going to fit in with what everybody else does and how we can all be working together. So I would say I like to help people connect the micro with the macro and also get to a place where they can be out of the weeds. They can feel confident in their direct intervention so that they can have the bandwidth to be thinking about all those things that have to do with collaboration. Because one of the biggest challenges that I hear from clinicians is, what am I going to have time to talk to all those people and, plan co-teaching and figure out how to talk to the social worker or the psychologist or the special ed teacher and everybody else. Yeah.
Yeah, that's quite the passion.
Yeah. And literacy obviously is, I would say, one of the things that because that's what you're doing in the schools, that's a thing that kept coming up for me. So it's a very good jumping off point to give specific examples for how all of that can play out.
Well, when you talk about literacy, it's interesting because when we talk about literacy in schools, as you know, we talk about literacy in a bunch of different areas. And it isn't just about reading. We talk about digital literacy. We talk about social media literacy.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
As a way of spreading it out. Now, me personally, I think that comes from the idea of how broad a topic literacy is. Mm-hmm. And when leaders tell teachers that they're all teachers of literacy, from your PE teacher to your especially science teacher. I mean, biology is a language all in its own that students have to get through.
Yeah.
So you said something that I want to revisit on that. You said you look at how you can fit into the bigger picture with the content area experts or all these different people.
Yeah.
Should you be looking to fit in with them, or should the leader be looking to have them fit in with you because you're at a more basic level with the students and helping them actually access the ability to read when it comes right down to it and be more successful in class?
I think it's both. Honestly, I think it's a two-way street. Yeah. I mean, I think that would be my basic, my initial answer. It is a shared responsibility. And I think that when you're in that role of and this is something that I tell people who are in that position, if they're a related service provider. Again, I can use SLPs as an example. So if I'm an SLP and I know that my students, like I'm getting referrals from teachers that are saying, I have this student in my class and they're just, maybe there are behaviors the student is not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And maybe it's because they have a language processing issue and they're not processing those directions. And it's not because they're trying to, be off task, but they're really not following along with the language and all of these, again, the linguistic demands of the classroom. Maybe when they're doing reading comprehension exercises, we're asking them, stating the main idea and, asking them to inference and problem solve. But if they don't have this understanding at the word and sentence level, because they don't have the vocabulary and the syntactic skills to comprehend a complex science textbook, that's going to cause an issue. And then there's also do they have the word decoding skills and are they using so many cognitive resources to decode? And so they don't have anything left for comprehension. So I would be thinking about all of those things. But I also know that if I'm a teacher and I've got all of these things going on, and then there's the speech pathologist who maybe knows what's going on, but it's not what the teacher thinks maybe it's not tied directly to that pain point that the teacher has. I think that I would, in that related service provider role, have the responsibility of connecting the dots for them. So, and I tell, the people in that subject matter expert role all the time, like, yes, people should listen to you. Yes, people should respect your expertise. But how do you get to a point where you build the relationship so that people are willing to listen? And I think that, one of the biggest pieces of advice that I give them is it's not always about what you think the problem is. It's about, like, how can you help this teacher or this administrator who has this thing that is this fire that is, this big, again, the hair on fire thing that they're trying to deal with. Can you help them with that's something that is their main priority, and figure out how to pull in your area of expertise, build that relationship, give them some quick wins, and then maybe create the situation where they would be open to working on this other thing that you think is a priority. Because I think one of the biggest mistakes that people in that related service provider will do is that when they give advice and support, always well-meaning, that it feels like they're putting something else on the teacher's plate that they have to do. And what you want to do is deliver the advice in a way that removes a barrier or takes something off of their plate. So I think that's the responsibility on the related service providers, plate. But I also think that the other party has to be willing to work with that as well. And, try some of the suggestions. And then I think from the leadership standpoint, you've got to create the space for people to have those conversations and figure out, like, how do you help them navigate all of the logistics of having time to meet? I mean, that's the biggest thing.
Right. See, and this is why we talk all the time, because that was the first question I was wondering is, okay, so does this look like common planning because it's a very specific skill set you're working on or a set of skills? Or is this a larger group PD for the whole school? And as I was thinking that, I was thinking about how I like to use related service providers for more than the service they're providing to students.
Yeah.
Because I think individuals like yourself have such a broader base of knowledge and understanding that if you're pigeonholed to just working with the students that have it on a plan, we're wasting your talent. For lack of a pretty fuzzy way to say it, we're wasting your talent. And so what does that look like in a school for working with the whole faculty? Can you give some examples? Do you have some examples of things that you could present to a whole faculty that would be useful to them, that would bring them back to you? Because it's about building trust. So the next time you come to them about an individual kid, they're like, oh yeah, hey, and she was talking about this and I learned this. Any ideas or examples of that?
So I think, obviously there's the reading and literacy piece. I mean, I don't know that there are any schools that don't think reading is important.
Right. Right. I would hope not.
Right. So I think that there could be some PD, like there could be some opportunities of some kind of a PLC where you're forming a group for, like, if you have if you're trying to create alignment across content areas and literacy, and you have a school that needs to work on reading specifically, I would say having those experts as part of the, any kind of problem solving team where you do have students who are being referred for services. So there's that piece. But then if there are some of those meetings where it's more bigger picture strategy curriculum, they can be involved in those conversations as well. To give a specific example of how it looked in the district that I was in. So I was in the schools when we made this switch from identifying students for learning disabilities by doing testing versus using response to intervention. So it's not that we weren't doing testing, it's just that we weren't relying solely on testing and using the discrepancy model to identify a student with a learning disability, which more often than not, it would be reading. Sometimes it would be something else. But so we're in this transition. It was like, I think we would sit in these strategy meetings on every Wednesday afternoon and just kind of go in circles because I don't think we felt like we were getting a lot of direction. Well, we're not supposed to use testing anymore. We understand why that's not a good model, but what is an evidence-based intervention that we could implement? Because you're supposed to do that before you get to the special ed evaluation. So what happened was, and I have to give props to the school psychologist because she said, we need the SLP on this team to, provide information on things like phonological awareness and vocabulary. So they pulled the speech pathologist in and we did some PD for the teachers in how to do the benchmark assessments. So we took some of the district-wide assessments that we were going to implement to identify students that might need tier 2 interventions. And we made them more robust and we trained some of the teachers in them, and the principal asked us to do some professional development to get some phonological awareness groups into the general education classroom. So they used us in that manner. And then we also did some of the delivery of those tier 2 interventions before it got to special ed evaluations. And they factored that into our caseload so that we had the bandwidth for that because they were asking us to do something above and beyond our caseload. So that was one way. And again, we had to have that administrative support because if you're going to tell a related service provider who has this huge caseload, I'm going to ask you to do all of these other things, that's going to be really difficult for them. A lot of them have a hard time even meeting their IEP minutes. So that's one way that it played out. That's one specific example. I think there's a lot of other opportunities in the area of executive functioning and training in universal accommodations which I think we could go down that route, which would be a whole other conversation. But I think the other thing, going back to what I said about how teachers need to feel like you're taking something off of their plate, not putting something on. And when you're talking about accommodations in the general education classroom, it feels like they're doing something extra. But if you can train them in things that they could be doing in their whole classroom, that is going to make things more accessible, facilitate learning, and maybe catch some kids and give them the support that they need before they get to the point of needing an evaluation, or providing accommodations that are universal to everyone, that are nice to have for some kids, but need to have for others. It doesn't feel like teachers have to do extra for all those kids who do have special education. And we're not eliminating special ed. We are making it more habitual for teachers to have that accessible so that it's better for a lot of kids, but for those kids who need it to access the curriculum, it makes it easier for people to implement it.
Karen, it sounds like you're talking about tier 1 interventions. Sounds like you slid tier 1 interventions.
Yeah, I stuck that in there. I started with tier 2. Well, again, as you can't fix the tier 3 problem. Well, no, you can't fix a tier 1 problem with a tier 3 intervention. And that's a lot of times what we're asked to do as, people getting those referrals. So, yeah.
And people think, a lot of times teachers think that it's extra in their classroom environment because they're implementing tier 2 interventions to fix tier 1 problems. And when they're doing that, it is actually extra work.
Yeah, exactly.
And so they're left with that taste in their mouth, but you're so on point with professional development in tier 1 interventions that everybody should be doing in the classroom as a normal practice is just absolutely essential. we actually wrote a list down that we came up with input from faculty that everybody sat around and said, yes, this is normal. We should be doing this in our classroom. So then everybody thought that it's just normal, run of the mill, everyday practice in the classroom. And as a result, our kids are getting tier 1 interventions, and you put it great. I'll probably mess up the quote. So paraphrasing you, it's nice for some kids. It's essential for other kids.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Essentially the difference between like instructional technology and assistive technology, or universal accommodations versus accommodations that are on someone's IEP that they have to have for, again, in order to be in compliance with their plan. So,
right.
Yeah.
Right.
Supporting your teachers and students seems to be a struggle. They just don't seem to be engaged. You wish they would take more responsibility for their learning and culture of the building, but they just don't seem to be empowered enough to do it. So, my question is, have you checked out the book Seeing to Lead yet? It's all about creating a true educational experience where learning, growth, leadership, and community take center stage. Full of strategies and resources, Seeing to Lead is about attaining that goal by employing a model that supports, engages, and empowers all individuals to become leaders themselves. Pick up a copy today at seeingtolead.com. That's seeingtolead.com. Remember, you don't become a leader and then decide you need to support and recognize others more than yourself. It is the moment you realize it's about supporting and recognizing others that you become a leader. seeingtolead.com.
So the idea of, and I'm glad you brought that up, and especially in literacy, the idea of tier 1 interventions. How do leaders get this going in their building, and how do teachers come to accept this? Is there a process that can be followed where we have specific interventions based on literacy? I hearken back, and this is maybe a broad brush, to, getting students to read books. And then they come back from a summer read and they're graded automatically on the reading book without thought about who needs what accommodation or how they're able to access that book, to reading in the classroom even. Is there a best practice that is like a tier 1 intervention for specifically literacy in your estimation?
Yeah. So there are two pieces here. There's what are effective ways to teach kids to read that will be effective for all students. And I know I hate to use absolutist language, but I'll clarify the nuance in that in a minute.
You'll get a pass.
Yeah.
You get a pass.
But then there's the change management side of getting people on board. So I'm going to talk about the evidence-based side first. So the science of reading is trending now, and I think it's really important to understand that it's not a curriculum. It's not a trend. It's, as the literacy experts would say, science of reading with a lowercase s. It is a evolving body of work that a lot of this research has stood the test of time as far as what was true 30 years ago is still true, and we've stacked and layered and added to it. So we know that there are certain things that, yes, if you provide implicit exposure and just give kids access to books, which of course is very important, but it's not going to be enough. Just reading with kids and, people talk about like the joy of reading and just make it interesting and engaging and give them books that they're interested in. And of course, we should be doing all of that. Of course, learning should be playful and fun. And it's, for many kids, a large portion of kids, they are not going to learn to read that way. So if you are relying on implicit learning, you're going to leave a lot of kids out. So that's why I hate to say all kids, because I would never say like this intervention is going to work 100% of the time.
Right,
so
right.
Obviously I would never make that statement, but there are certain components that need to be there. Kids need to have structured interventions. They need to understand the relationship between print symbols and language. And we know that oral language builds the foundation for that, but it's a good way to explain it is that we have biologically primary skills and biologically secondary skills. Language is biologically primary. Yes, some kids have disabilities that make it so that we do have to give them more direct intervention, but a lot of people we learn language through exposure. So that is something that we're biologically wired to do. Reading and writing, we can learn to do, but we need to be taught to do it. And yes, some people just naturally are able to make those connections implicitly, but for a large portion of kids, they need those interventions to be direct. So they need, again, the phonics instruction. It's not, and then, the instruction in morphology. So understanding like prefixes and suffixes and those other linguistic patterns, attention to the vocabulary, attention to the syntax, all of these things that are going to impact how well you're going to be able to efficiently pull words off the page, be able to understand the orthographic patterns, so those spelling patterns, and understand why words are spelled the way that they are. And I think that some people are like, English doesn't make sense. It's so confusing. And it's not that it doesn't make sense. It's just that it's very dense as far as the orthography. So like there's not a one-to-one correspondence with one letter and one sound. There's all these different patterns. English has influences from like Greek and Latin. And so we have to teach those to kids. So if you are ignoring those things and not giving kids those word attack skills and doing things like just look at the first letter of the word and guess, or use the context to try to decode a word, those aren't going to teach kids to read the words. So I think that is some of those methods have gained traction because they sound good on paper and they sound easier, but they don't teach kids to read. And so I think the other thing is that some of my structured literacy advocates have said, they did the balanced literacy thing and they thought, oh, my kids will be so bored with phonics. But they were like, no, kids are so excited to be able to pull words off the page. They're like, oh my gosh, I did it. I'm like, it's fun now because I can do it. So I think with understanding the joy of reading, like it's hard to have joy for something if you're not taught how to do it. So I think that would be one of my things, is that we've got to get people on board with evidence-based intervention and instruction and understand how kids learn to read and understand that this is not a trend. It's not a curriculum. And that, yes, we can, another distinction that I think is really helpful, like play-based versus playful. Things can be challenging, but still engaging and fun. And that's where the art of teaching comes in. So I could rant a long time about this, but yeah,
you don't say.
That's where I'd go with it. But again, like I think the leaders have to be championing this, and they have to understand what kids need in order to learn to read, and just then the change management side of, okay, how do I get people on board with this if they've really bought in to these other methods? And unfortunately, a lot of teacher preparation programs do, pull people in with some of these ideas that unfortunately, again, they sound nice on paper, but in reality, they don't work, or they leave a lot of kids out. They work for some kids. So there's a little confirmation bias going on there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You said, so the change management side, I think I've got the change management side wrapped up in something you said that I think is so powerful.
Yeah.
I want to repeat it because it has to do with change. Everybody struggles with change to a degree because it's different. We get comfortable, we get in our ruts, and we often need something to bump us out of that rut that we argue about, but then we're okay moving along. The idea of change, yes, it can be scary. It's difficult, but it's typically exciting. Now, people don't get excited about it. And here's where what you said comes to play, that I need every listener to hear this, is it's hard to have joy for something if you're not taught how to do it. And I think as a leader, that resonates with me when I want teachers to do something, or I want them to change something the way they're doing. How often, because I've made this mistake, so I'm assuming that other leaders have made this mistake, you make the change and you haven't taught them exactly how to do the change. You give them the beginning of it, but you haven't walked them through it step by step, thinking that, oh, they're professionals, they're smart, they get it. Where they don't understand all the different things you're thinking in your head or why it needs to be done. So they automatically resist it. And then initiatives fall apart. Needed changes around, especially literacy, fall apart. So I think that's just really something when we're talking about change management, the idea of you have to be explicit and teach people so that they too can be excited about change.
Yeah. Kind of the same thing with kids. Like they need explicit instruction. I think that the teachers and therapists and administrators, we need scaffolded learning as well.
Yeah. 100%.
I don't know that the administrators get it. I think I was talking to someone the other day. I think it gets worse the more you go. Like as far as the amount of onboarding you get, you go figure it out.
You almost get like a little scrap piece of paper with a handwritten note saying, get it done. Do this, get it done.
Yep. Yeah.
But look, I could talk to you forever, but it seems like we're creating a habit of this. So we can do things. And I really think we covered the literacy piece and how important it is and some different ways to do it. There's some useful things in here that I think people are going to take away. So I do have, hopefully you've been on a couple of times. You haven't forgotten the 2 questions that I asked.
Oh, yeah. Oh, here we go.
Did you just sigh and say, oh?
Well, because I'm like, I can't use my answer I used before. I've got to think of something different. And it's got to be good.
It might be the same.
Okay.
So if you were an educator, what would you be?
If I wasn't an educator, what would I be? So last time I said, I'm always an educator in everything I do, even if I'm not officially. So let me think here. Okay, I'm going to take this a certain direction that is going to sound boring, but I'm going to go with it. But I like to say I am a risk mitigator, which doesn't sound exciting on paper, but I think that mitigating risk and putting things in place up front, it creates freedom and structure for creativity, which is where the fun starts. So if you do the work up front, that's where you get to have the fun and the engagement and the enjoyment. And if you don't do that, then you create chaos and it makes it very difficult to be creative and have the freedom that you want. So I'm going to go with the discipline equals freedom.
That's almost discipline equals freedom. That's
got to quote Jocko in there.
You're like, you're saying, oh, it's got to be good and I'm not sure. It's like you stepped up to that question and pointed at the fence like Babe Ruth. That's a home run. That's not boring. Risk mitigation.
Yeah, I know, but risk mitigation, you sound like an insurance agent. It's not the sexiest answer, but again, it's a counterintuitive way to create, like I said, engagement and joy and love of what you're doing because you have the confidence. Then you get rid of the anxiety and the resistance.
And not to mention you sealed the deal with quoting Jocko. So that counts for some points too.
Yeah, there you go.
So the last one. Most important piece of advice you'd give to leaders as they work to better support, engage, and empower those they serve, and let me add a twist on it, in improving literacy where they reside.
So I would say that you define your boundaries and your non-negotiables so that you can, again, create the space for the art. Define the science, create the boundaries with the science part where these are things that have to be there. And what that can do is then clarify where we can bring in the art of teaching and how you can take this, create some constraints, give people some bumpers for what needs to be done so that they can then take it and go with it and add their own flair and creativity and make it engaging.
Karen, every time you come on, you've got so many great things to give to people that I'm sure they're going to, too bad I couldn't say this at the beginning, but they should have a notebook out. But now maybe they'll go back and listen again with a notebook out. So that'd be a good thing. How do they get in touch with you for some of this fantastic advice? What's the best way besides listening to your podcast, which is awesome, by the way, De Facto Leaders? What's another way they can get in touch with you?
Well, they should listen to the episode that was published on, what day is it? Oh, it's going to be published next week, August 14th with you and Chris Dodge. I cannot remember the episode number off the top of my head, but they should listen to that. We talked about middle management. So 2 places that they can go. So if something that I originally created for SLPs, which I have had some other teachers say that it's really helpful. I have a guide called The Ultimate Guide to Sentence Structure. And one of the things that causes comprehension issues, aside from word decoding, is when kids do not have the adequate syntactic structures in order to comprehend sentences. So this happens with students with things like developmental language disorder, dyslexia, anything that's going to impact language, as well as people who are learning English. There are certain sentence types that tend to be difficult and impact comprehension. So I have a guide where I walk through what those sentence types are and some suggestions for working on them. So it says it's for SLPs, but it can be really for anybody in education. So it's to download that guide, you can go to drkarenspeech.com/sentence structure. And then on the side of getting into the change management and the idea of working as a team and universal supports, I have an executive functioning implementation guide that walks through what everyone's role is on the school team in supporting executive functioning. So I go through the administrator, the student, the parent, the teachers. What is everyone's role in this process of supporting executive functioning? What is it? What are some things that we're doing that where I wouldn't say that they're incorrect, but incomplete, or maybe we're misunderstanding what intervention is going to work on what skill. So I go through that in the guide. So you can download that guide at drkarendudek-brannan.com/EF guide.
Look at that. Not only great advice, he gave people 2 resources that they can go down and check out. So now, Karen, those resources, are they any age?
Any age.
For students?
No. So they're for like anybody can download them. They're just like free PDFs. So.
But are they effective? I would think the executive functioning one is effective all the way up through high school. Is the same?
Oh, okay. So
is that the same thing with sentence structure?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, that's a great question. Okay. So, this is a very common myth is that, what happens with syntax is a lot of times people think, complex sentences, it's for older kids. Kids start to use complex sentences in oral language when they're in kindergarten. I mean, they're already using it, but a lot of kids still need that work in high school. So again, that could be applicable. Obviously, this is where the art comes in, that you have to learn how to apply this to something that is appropriate for that age. So yes, that is appropriate for K-12. And I would say the same thing with executive functioning. Again, you've got to learn to tailor it, but we should be thinking about putting that scaffolding in place K through 12 and honestly beyond. But yes, it would be for anyone within the school age years all the way up through high school.
Awesome. Well, better than promised. Thank you for coming on again. And if we keep this up, you'll probably become the most appearing guest on my podcast. So we'll have to talk about that.
Yeah, well, we should. I would love that. I would love to have some regular both ways on De Facto Leaders and on Seeing to Lead. So
yeah, that'd be great. Well, thank you very much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Well, that's a wrap, but not the end. Next step, be sure to take action on something you heard here today. Hey, thanks for listening to the Seeing to Lead podcast. If you would like to connect for any reason, email me at drchrissj@gmail.com or catch me on Twitter at drcsjones. If you've gotten any value from the Seeing to Lead podcast today, you can help me and other leaders create a world-class environment through a teacher-centric approach by subscribing to the show, leaving an honest rating or review, and sharing this episode on social media with your most valuable takeaway. Also, one last thing. Have you had a chance to pick up my latest 5-star rated book yet? Grab your copy of Seeing to Lead anywhere you buy books or at seeingtolead.com. That's seingtolead.com, where you can learn more and continue to improve. Now go have a successful week.